I knew something was wrong the moment everyone laughed before I even opened the Easter egg my daughter-in-law had just handed me, and somehow, I still smiled as if I didn't notice. I'm glad you're here, and if you've ever sat at a table where you felt like you didn't quite belong anymore, then you'll understand exactly what I'm about to tell you. Easter had always been my favorite holiday, even more than Christmas, because it was quieter, softer, less about gifts and more about togetherness, or at least that's what it used to be. That Sunday morning, I woke up earlier than usual in my small suburban home just outside Columbus, Ohio, the same home my late husband and I had paid off after 32 years of careful budgeting and skipped vacations. The sunlight filtered gently through the kitchen curtains as I set out the dishes I had prepared the night before: glazed ham, deviled eggs, roasted carrots, and the lemon cake my son Daniel used to beg me to make when he was a boy. At 68, I no longer moved as quickly as I once did, but I still believed in showing up for family, in keeping traditions alive even when they seemed to matter less to everyone else. Daniel had called earlier in the week to say they'd be hosting Easter this year at their place, a newer, larger house about 15 minutes away, one that I had quietly contributed to when they were struggling with the down payment, though that detail was rarely mentioned anymore. His wife, Ashley, had insisted on doing things her way, which I told myself was only natural for a younger woman building her own household. Still, there had been something in her tone on the phone, something overly sweet, almost rehearsed, that left a faint uneasiness sitting in my chest. When I arrived at their house that afternoon, the driveway was already full, cars lined neatly along the curb, laughter spilling out from the open front door. The house looked beautiful, I had to admit: pastel decorations, fresh flowers, a long dining table set with polished plates and gold-trimmed napkins. Ashley greeted me at the door with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Margaret, you made it," she said, leaning in for a quick, careful hug, the kind that never quite felt real. Daniel stood just behind her, hands in his pockets, offering me a small nod instead of the warm embrace he used to give me without thinking. "Happy Easter, Mom," he said, his voice polite, distant. I handed Ashley the small basket I had brought for my grandson, filled with chocolate bunnies and jelly beans, and she took it with a quick glance, as if assessing its value rather than appreciating the gesture. The house buzzed with conversation, relatives and friends moving in clusters, glasses clinking, children running through the hallway with plastic eggs. I took my usual place slightly to the side, close enough to be included, but far enough not to interfere. That had become my role over the years, present, but not central. We gathered around the dining table an hour later, everyone settling into their seats, the hum of conversation lowering into something more focused, more performative. Ashley stood at the head of the table, her posture confident, her smile polished as she thanked everyone for coming. Then, as if remembering something, she turned toward me with a sudden brightness. "Oh, and Margaret," she said, her voice lifting just enough to draw attention, "I got you something special this year." A few heads turned. I felt the shift immediately, subtle but unmistakable. She disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned holding a large, beautifully wrapped chocolate egg, the kind you'd see displayed in upscale bakery windows, tied with a satin ribbon and decorated with delicate pastel patterns. It was almost too perfect. She placed it in front of me with a flourish, her fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. "For you," she said. The room grew quieter, not silent, but expectant. I could feel eyes on me, waiting. I smiled, of course I did. "Thank you, Ashley," I said, keeping my voice even, appreciative, as I rested my hands on the smooth surface of the chocolate shell. It felt heavier than I expected. Someone chuckled softly from the other end of the table. I wasn't sure who. "Go on, open it," Ashley added, her tone light, almost playful, but there was something underneath it, something that made my stomach tighten. I carefully untied the ribbon, aware of every movement, every glance, every breath in the room. The laughter came again, a little louder this time, just as my fingers found the seam of the chocolate egg. And that's when I understood, before I even saw what was inside, before the shell split open, before anything was revealed, I understood that this wasn't a gift. It was something else entirely, something planned, something deliberate. And yet I kept smiling, because after all these years, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not react at all. I let the shells separate slowly in my hands, careful not to rush, careful not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing even the smallest crack in my composure. And as the two halves opened, a few small wrapped candies slipped onto the plate in front of me, harmless at first glance, almost charming, but it was what sat nestled at the center that held my attention, a folded piece of paper, thin, deliberate, placed there with intention, not decoration, not accident, intention. The laughter around the table softened into something more controlled, more contained, like people trying not to react too loudly, and I could feel it, the way the room leaned in without appearing to do so. I reached for the paper, my fingers steady despite the quiet tightening in my chest, and unfolded it with the same care I might have used years ago opening a letter from my husband when he was traveling for work. Except this time there was no warmth waiting for me, only a sentence written in neat, looping handwriting that I recognized immediately as Ashley's. For everything you have taken, consider this a sweet return. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be certain I understood the tone correctly. And yes, it was exactly what it sounded like, a performance disguised as a gift, a message meant to humiliate, while still allowing her the comfort of plausible innocence. I lifted my eyes from the paper and met hers across the table, and she smiled at me, bright and polished, as if we were sharing a private joke instead of a quiet declaration of something much colder. "Is it good?" she asked lightly, tilting her head just enough to seem curious, but not concerned. I folded the note back along its crease and set it gently beside my plate. "It is very thoughtful," I said, and my voice did not shake, not even slightly, which seemed to surprise her more than anything else. Daniel shifted in his seat beside her, clearing his throat as he reached for his glass, avoiding my gaze the way he had been doing all afternoon, and I wondered, not for the first time, how much he knew, how much he chose not to know, and whether there was any meaningful difference between the two. Conversation resumed around the table, though it never quite returned to its earlier ease. There was a new layer now, something unspoken but present, like a thin film over everything, and I sat there, cutting small pieces of ham, nodding when spoken to, smiling when expected, all while the words on that paper settled quietly into place inside me. "For everything you have taken." It was such an interesting choice of phrasing, because if there was one thing I had spent the better part of my life doing, it was giving time, giving money, giving patience, giving second chances, and yet here I was, being reframed as someone who had taken. I let that thought sit with me as I watched Ashley move around the table, refilling glasses, laughing at something one of her friends said, playing the role of gracious host with effortless precision. She was very good at it. I had to admit that, very good at creating a version of reality that others were willing to accept without question. After the meal, people drifted into the living room, plates left half full, conversations breaking into smaller groups, and I carried my plate to the kitchen, more out of habit than necessity. The sink was already filling with dishes, and I began rinsing them quietly, listening to the hum of voices behind me. Ashley joined me a moment later, placing a serving dish on the counter with a soft clink. "You did not have to help," she said, though she made no move to stop me. "I do not mind," I replied, keeping my eyes on the water as it ran over the plate in my hands. There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to become noticeable. "I hope you did not take the gift the wrong way," she added, her tone light, almost dismissive, as if the entire thing could be reduced to a misunderstanding. I turned off the faucet and reached for a towel, drying my hands slowly before looking at her. "I took it exactly the way it was meant," I said, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in her expression, not guilt, not quite, but recognition, as if she realized that I had seen more than she intended me to. She recovered quickly, of course she did, offering a small shrug and a smile that suggested the matter was trivial. "Good," she said. "I am glad we understand each other." I nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and walked past her back into the living room, where Daniel stood near the window, staring out at the backyard as if there were something out there worth studying. I did not approach him, not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, I returned to my seat, the empty halves of the chocolate egg still resting on the table behind me, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever she thought she had started, it was not over, not even close. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, It was that people who underestimate you tend to reveal far more than they intend, and all you have to do is wait long enough to see it clearly. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a way that would have seemed perfectly ordinary to anyone who had not been paying attention, and that was precisely what made it so revealing to me. I remained seated for a while, listening to the overlapping conversations, watching the way people positioned themselves in the room, who stood near whom, who avoided whom, and more importantly, who looked at me and then quickly looked away. It is a strange thing, noticing how silence can say more than words, how a brief glance can carry more truth than an entire conversation. I saw it in Daniel most clearly, the way his shoulders stiffened slightly whenever I moved within his line of sight, the way he kept himself occupied with small, unnecessary tasks, adjusting the blinds, checking his phone, picking up a glass that did not need to be moved. It was not anger I saw in him, not even discomfort in the usual sense. It was something quieter, something that felt closer to avoidance, as if acknowledging me fully would require him to acknowledge something else he was not ready to face. I did not approach him, not yet, because there is a moment in every situation like this when speaking too soon can close doors that are better left open, at least for a little while longer. Instead, I let myself observe, taking in the details I might have dismissed before, the way Ashley laughed just a fraction too long at certain comments, the way she guided conversations subtly, steering them away from anything that might invite questions, the way she checked the room without appearing to do so, always aware, always in control of the narrative she was building. It was not new behavior, not entirely, but it was clearer now, sharper, as if something inside me had shifted just enough to bring it into focus. After some time, I rose from my seat and moved slowly toward the hallway, where the framed photographs lined the wall, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, small milestones that once felt like evidence of a life well shared. I paused in front of one from several years ago, Daniel standing beside me in my old kitchen, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling in a way that felt unguarded, effortless. I remembered that day clearly, the way he had shown up without calling first, the way he had insisted on helping me fix a cabinet door that had been sticking for months, the way we had ended up sitting at the table afterward, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. It struck me then how gradual the changes had been, how easy it was to miss them while they were happening, how a shift in tone here, a canceled visit there, a new priority slowly replacing an old one, could add up to something much larger without ever announcing itself directly. That was a nice day, a voice said softly behind me, and I turned to see Daniel standing a few feet away, his hands now at his sides, his expression uncertain. I followed, his gaze to the photograph, and nodded. It was, I said. There was a pause, the kind that invites honesty but does not demand it. You have not come by in a while, I added, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. He shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the living room before looking back at me. Things have just been busy, he replied, the words coming out quickly, almost rehearsed. Work and the house, and you know how it is. I didn't know how it was, at least the version he was offering, but I also knew how easily busyness can become a convenient explanation for distance. I suppose I do, I said, allowing a small, understanding smile to settle on my face. He seemed relieved by that, as if he had been bracing for something more difficult, something that would require him to engage in a way he was not prepared for. The egg, he began suddenly, then stopped, his eyes flickering with hesitation. Ashley just thought it would be, a joke. Something light. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough to let the weight of his words settle between us. Did you think it was light? I asked quietly. He looked away first, his attention dropping to the floor, and that told me more than any answer could have. I did not really think about it, he admitted after a moment, his voice lower now. It just seemed like something she had already planned. Of course it had been planned. That much was obvious. But what interested me more was his willingness to stand beside it without question, to accept it as something that did not require his intervention. That is often how these things work, I said, my tone even, not unkind, but not soft enough to be dismissed either. He nodded slightly, though I could tell he did not fully understand what I meant. Not yet. I should get back, he said after a moment, gesturing vaguely toward the living room, and I inclined my head in acknowledgement. Of course, I replied. As he walked away, I remained where I was for a few seconds longer, looking once more at the photograph on the wall, then at the space he had just vacated. There is a point when you realize that waiting for things to return to what they were is no longer a useful strategy, that the version of the past you are holding on to exists only in memory, not in the present you are standing in. I turned then and made my way back toward the living room, my steps measured, my posture unchanged, and as I re-entered the space, I noticed Ashley watching me from across the room, her expression composed, curious, as if she were trying to determine whether her message had landed the way she intended. I met her gaze briefly, just long enough to acknowledge that I had seen it, all of it, and then I looked away, taking my seat once more, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and allowing the quiet understanding to settle in that whatever came next would not be dictated by her, not anymore, because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and more importantly, I knew that I had all the time in the world to decide how to respond. I stayed until the last of the guests began to gather their coats and exchange polite goodbyes, because leaving too early would have been noticed, and I had no intention of giving anyone the satisfaction of interpreting my actions for me. Not today, not anymore. The sun had already started to dip lower by the time I stepped outside, the air carrying that faint chill that lingers in early spring even after a warm afternoon, and I paused for just a moment beside my car, letting the quiet settle around me before unlocking the door. Inside, everything was still, untouched, exactly as I had left it that morning, and there was something almost comforting about that. The predictability of my own space after an afternoon that had been carefully arranged to feel anything but. I set my keys down on the small wooden table near the entrance and hung my coat with the same deliberate movements I had practiced over decades, small rituals that anchor you when everything else feels slightly off balance. The house did not feel empty, not in the way people often describe. It felt steady, grounded, like a place that remembered who I was even if others had begun to forget. I moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, standing by the sink as I took a slow sip, my mind replaying the afternoon not in a rush, but in pieces, like photographs being laid out one by one. The note inside the egg, Ashley's voice in the kitchen, Daniel's hesitation in the hallway, the laughter that came just a second too early, all of it fitting together now in a way that was difficult to ignore. I set the glass down and leaned my hands lightly against the counter, allowing myself to think about something I had not wanted to examine too closely before, not because I could not see it, but because naming it would have made it real. For everything you have taken, the words returned, not as a sting this time, but as a question. What, exactly, did she believe I had taken from her, from them, from anyone? I walked slowly into the living room and sat down in the armchair near the window, the one my husband used to prefer in the evenings, and I let the silence stretch out around me as I considered the years that had led to this moment. There had been the loan, of course, the one I had given them when they first found the house. A check written without hesitation because Daniel's voice on the phone had carried that familiar mix of hope and worry that no mother ever truly learns to ignore. "We will pay you back," he had said at the time, and I had told him not to rush, not to concern himself with details when they were just starting out, because that is what you do when you believe you are building something together. There had been other things too, smaller on their own, but significant in accumulation. The weekends spent watching my grandson so they could travel, the groceries I would pick up and drop off without being asked, the quiet contributions that never required acknowledgement because they were given freely. I had never kept a record, never felt the need to measure what was given against what was received, because that is not how I understood family. But sitting there now, I began to see how easily generosity can be reinterpreted by someone determined to see it differently, how support can be reframed as interference, how presence can be recast as obligation. I thought about Ashley then, about the first time I had met her, the way she had presented herself with such careful warmth. Attentive, respectful, almost eager to be liked, and I wondered when that had shifted, or if it ever truly existed in the first place. There had been small moments, I realized now, comments delivered with a smile that did not quite match the words, suggestions phrased as helpful advice that subtly redirected decisions, little adjustments that over time had created distance where there had once been ease. I had noticed them, of course I had, but I had chosen to interpret them kindly, to give the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions even when something inside me hesitated. It is a habit that forms over years, that instinct to smooth things over, to keep peace where possible, to avoid unnecessary conflict. And for a long time, it had served me well. But habits can also become blind spots, and blind spots can be used by those who recognize them. I stood then and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the room, the one where I kept my documents, my bills, my records, everything organized in neat folders that reflected a lifetime of careful management. I opened the top drawer and ran my fingers lightly over the folders, not searching for anything specific, not yet, but acknowledging something that had shifted inside me, something that no longer felt content to simply observe. This was not about a piece of chocolate or a note hidden inside it. Not really. It was about what that note represented, the assumption behind it, the belief that I would read those words and quietly accept them, that I would continue playing the role that had been assigned to me without question. I closed the drawer gently and rested my hand on the surface of the desk, my reflection faintly visible in the dark wood, older, perhaps, than I felt that morning, but clearer in a way that surprised me. There is a moment when you realize that understanding a situation is not the same as accepting it, and that moment does not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrives quietly, almost calmly, like a decision that has been waiting for you to notice it. I turned off the light in the living room and made my way upstairs, the house settling around me as it always did at the end of the day. And as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking not about what had happened, but about what would come next, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to what others chose to do. I was beginning to consider what I might choose to do in return, and that, more than anything else, felt like the beginning of something entirely different. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had to, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, quietly organizing thoughts that had been waiting for space to unfold. And as I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, I realized that the feeling sitting in my chest was no longer confusion or even hurt. It was clarity, steady and unmistakable. I moved through my usual routine without rushing, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft morning light settle into the rooms that had always felt like mine in a way nothing else ever could. There was comfort in that, in knowing that some things remained unchanged, regardless of what shifted outside these walls. I carried my coffee to the small desk in the corner of the living room and sat down, pulling open the top drawer with a calm I had not felt the night before. This time, I was not simply acknowledging what was inside, I was looking with intention. The folders were exactly as I had left them, labeled neatly, each one holding pieces of a life built over decades of careful decisions. And as I opened the first one, I found the documents related to the loan I had given Daniel and Ashley for their house. The amount was clearly stated, the date, the transfer, everything documented in a way that reflected how seriously I had always taken responsibility, even when I had chosen not to press for repayment. I remembered the day I had written that check, how Daniel's voice had carried relief when I told him not to worry about timelines, how Ashley had thanked me with a smile that seemed genuine at the time. I let that memory sit for a moment before setting it aside and moving on to the next folder. Bank statements, records of smaller transfers over the years, payments I had made quietly, never announcing them, never expecting. Acknowledgement, because I had believed that intention mattered more than recognition. But intention, I was beginning to understand, does not always translate the way you expect it to, especially in the hands of someone who chooses to see it differently. I reached for a notepad and a pen, not because I felt the need to prove anything to myself, but because putting things in order has always helped me think more clearly. I began to write, listing dates, amounts, small notes to myself that connected each piece to a moment I could still recall. And as the list grew, so did my understanding of just how much I had given without ever truly taking stock of it. It was not about the money, not entirely. It was about the narrative that had been quietly built around it, the idea that I had somehow taken more than I had contributed, that my presence had been a burden rather than a foundation. I paused, setting the pen down for a moment, and looked at the page in front of me, not with anger, but with a kind of measured awareness that felt new, almost unfamiliar. This was not a reaction. I reminded myself, this was information, and information, when handled correctly, has a way of changing things without the need for raised voices or dramatic confrontations. I closed the folder and placed it neatly beside the others, then reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed to call in quite some time. Martin Reynolds had handled my husband's estate years ago, a man known for his thoroughness and discretion, someone who understood that not all matters required urgency, but all required care. I hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button, listening to the soft ringing on the other end as I considered what I would say. When he answered, his voice was the same as I remembered, calm, professional, with just enough warmth to suggest familiarity without overstepping it. "Mrs. Collins," he said, recognizing my number, which in itself told me something about the kind of man he was. "It has been a while." "It has," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I hope you are well." We exchanged a few brief pleasantries before I moved to the point, explaining that I needed to review some documents, that I wanted to understand my current position clearly, nothing urgent, just clarity. He did not ask unnecessary questions, did not assume anything beyond what I offered, simply agreed to meet later in the week, suggesting a time that worked for both of us. When I ended the call, I set the phone down gently and sat back in my chair, letting the quiet return. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the distant sound of tires against pavement blending into the background in a way that felt oddly grounding. I looked again at the notepad, at the list I had started, and then at the folders neatly arranged on the desk, and for the first time since the previous afternoon, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not because anything had been resolved, not because any action had been taken yet, but because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before. That control does not always come from speaking first or speaking loudest. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly what you have, exactly what has been done, and exactly how you intend to move forward. I gathered the papers carefully and returned them to their place, closing the drawer with a quiet finality that felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something that had been waiting, patiently, for me to see it clearly. The days leading up to my meeting with Martin passed with a kind of quiet precision that I had not experienced in a long time, as if each hour had found its place without needing to be forced into it, and I moved through them with the same steady rhythm, making my coffee in the morning, tending to the small details of the house, and returning again and again to the desk where the folders now held a different weight than they once had. It was not urgency that guided me, but intention, the kind that builds slowly and does not require constant reassurance. I added to my notes when something came to mind, dates that surfaced unexpectedly, small moments that connected to larger decisions, and with each addition, the picture became clearer, not more complicated, just more complete. I did not call Daniel, and he did not call me, which in itself felt like an answer to a question I had not yet asked out loud. On Wednesday afternoon, I dressed with the same care I had always given to important appointments, not out of habit alone, but because there is something about presenting yourself with intention that reminds you of who you are, regardless of how others may choose to see you. The drive to Martin's office took about 20 minutes, the familiar route lined with early spring trees just beginning to show signs of new growth, and I found myself noticing the details in a way I had not before, the way the light shifted across the pavement, the way the air felt just slightly warmer than it had been a week ago. His office building stood exactly as I remembered it, understated, professional, the kind of place that does not need to announce its importance to be recognized. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to have a seat, and I did, folding my hands neatly in my lap as I waited, observing the quiet efficiency of the space around me. When Martin appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, he offered a warm but measured greeting, guiding me into his office where everything was arranged with the same careful order I had always appreciated about him. We sat across from each other, the desk between us not as a barrier, but as a place where information could be laid out clearly. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Collins?" he asked, his tone open, attentive. I placed the folder I had brought with me on the desk and opened it slowly, not rushing, allowing the documents to speak for themselves as I explained, in simple terms, that I wanted to review my financial contributions over the past several years, that I wanted to understand my position not just in theory, but in detail. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally making a small note, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly, considering what I had presented. "You have been very thorough," he said, and there was a note of respect in his voice that I recognized. More than most people are in situations like this. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the observation without elaborating. I prefer clarity, I replied. He smiled faintly at that, then began to walk me through what the documents represented, the implications of the loan, the transfers, the absence of formal agreements in some cases, and what that meant in practical terms. There was nothing dramatic in his explanation, no sudden revelations, just a steady unfolding of facts, each one placed carefully in context. Legally, some of these contributions would be difficult to recover in the traditional sense, he said at one point, his tone matter of fact, not discouraging, simply honest. However, that does not mean they are without influence. I met his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant. Influence is not always about what can be enforced. It is often about what can be demonstrated, what can be understood by others when presented clearly. What would you suggest? I asked, not because I did not have my own thoughts, but because I wanted to hear how he would frame the situation. He considered for a moment before responding. I would suggest that you decide what outcome you want first, he said. Then we determine the most appropriate way to move toward it. It was a simple statement, but it settled into place with a clarity that felt almost immediate. Outcome. Not reaction, not response, outcome. I thanked him for his time, for his insight, and we agreed to remain in contact as I considered my next steps. When I left the office, the afternoon light had shifted again, casting longer shadows across the parking lot, and as I walked to my car, I felt a quiet sense of alignment that had not been there before. This was no longer about what had happened at a holiday table or what had been written on a piece of paper. It was about direction, about choosing deliberately rather than reacting instinctively. As I drove home, I thought about the egg, about the note, about the way Ashley had watched me as I opened it, and I realized that in her own way, she had revealed more than she intended, not just about her perception of me, but about her assumptions, her expectations, and most importantly, her confidence that I would continue to behave in a way that made her position easy. I turned onto my street and slowed as I approached my house, the familiar sight of it grounding in a way that felt different now, not just a place of comfort, but a place of preparation. When I stepped inside, I did not go to the kitchen or the living room right away. Instead, I walked directly to the desk and opened the drawer once more, looking at the folders not as records of the past, but as tools for what came next. I did not rush to act, did not reach for the phone or the pen. I simply stood there for a moment, allowing the understanding to settle fully, because once you know what you want, once you see the path clearly, there is no need to hurry. The next move becomes less about speed and more about precision, and I had learned, over many years, that precision is what changes outcomes. I did not reach out to Daniel that evening, and I did not need to, because sometimes silence has a way of inviting exactly the kind of movement you are waiting to observe, and sure enough, it came 2 days later in the form of a brief message that appeared on my phone just after noon, simple, polite, almost careful in its wording. Hey Mom, Ashley and I were thinking about having you over for dinner this weekend if you are free. I read it once, then again, not because there was anything unclear about it, but because I wanted to understand the tone behind it. And there it was, that subtle shift, not quite warmth, not quite obligation, but something in between, something that suggested they were reaching out not from ease, but from awareness. I set the phone down for a moment, letting the message sit without responding, because timing, I had learned, often speaks louder than the words themselves. I moved through the afternoon as I normally would, tending to small tasks, watering the plants by the window, straightening a stack of mail on the table, all while the message remained unanswered, not ignored, just unhurried. By early evening, I picked up the phone again and replied with a simple confirmation, "That sounds fine." What time? Keeping my tone neutral, open, offering nothing that could be interpreted beyond what was written. The response came. Quickly, almost too quickly, 6 o'clock works if that is okay, followed by a brief, "Looking forward to it." I did not read too much into that. Not yet, because anticipation can sometimes cloud observation, and I was no longer interested in assumptions. Saturday arrived with the same quiet steadiness that had marked the rest of the week, and I prepared for the evening without excess, choosing a simple blouse, something appropriate, something that did not draw attention but did not diminish it either. When I arrived at their house, the atmosphere felt different, not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed it immediately. The door opened before I had a chance to knock a second time. Ashley standing there with a smile that seemed slightly more measured than before, her posture just a touch more attentive. "Margaret, come in," she said, stepping aside, her voice smooth, practiced, but with a faint edge of something I could not quite name yet. Daniel appeared behind her, offering a small nod, his expression less distant than it had been at the holiday gathering, though not entirely relaxed either. "Glad you could make it, Mom," he said, and I inclined my head in acknowledgement as I stepped inside. The house was tidy, carefully arranged, as it always was, but there was a sense of preparation that extended beyond the physical space, something in the way they moved, the way they watched, as if they were anticipating something without fully understanding what it might be. We sat down at the table a few minutes later, the three of us, the setting smaller, more contained than the last time, and for a while, the conversation remained comfortably ordinary, discussions about the weather, about small updates that carried no weight, the kind of exchanges that fill space without revealing anything of substance. I participated just enough to maintain the rhythm, offering responses that were polite, appropriate, but not expansive, allowing them to guide the direction without interference. It did not take long for the shift to come. Ashley was the one who introduced it, placing her fork down with a soft, deliberate motion, her eyes lifting to meet mine with a brightness that felt intentional. "I have been thinking about something," she said, her tone light but purposeful, and I recognized the moment immediately, the point at which the surface gives way to what lies underneath. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice even, inviting but not encouraging. She smiled slightly, as if pleased with the opening. "About how things have been lately," she continued, her gaze steady, her posture composed. "I feel like there has been some tension, and I just want to make sure we are all on the same page." Daniel shifted beside her, his hand moving toward his glass, his attention fixed on the table rather than on either of us, and I noted it without reacting. "And what page would that be?" I asked quietly, not challenging, simply precise. There was a brief pause, just long enough to reveal that she had expected a different kind of response, perhaps something more defensive, something easier to navigate. "Just that we all understand each other's roles," she said, choosing her words carefully now. "And boundaries." I let the words settle between us. Boundaries, such a convenient term when used without context, when shaped to fit a narrative rather than reflect a reality. "That is important," I said, nodding slightly, allowing agreement where it could not be misinterpreted. Clarity is always useful. She seemed to relax slightly at that, perhaps believing the conversation was moving in a direction she could manage, and Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. But I was not finished, not yet. "It is interesting," I continued, my tone unchanged, "how clarity often arrives after something has already been misunderstood." The room grew quieter, not silent, but focused, the kind of quiet that gathers when something has shifted just enough to be noticed. Ashley's smile held, but it tightened at the edges, and Daniel's gaze lifted briefly before dropping again. I did not press further, not in that moment, because the purpose was not to resolve anything immediately. It was to observe, to allow them to reveal how they would respond when the conversation moved beyond the surface. And as I sat there, watching, listening, I understood that this was no longer about what had been said before. It was about what would be revealed now, piece by piece, in the spaces between their words, and I had every intention of letting those pieces fall exactly where they needed to. Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, just enough for me to notice, though anyone else might have missed it, and for a moment, she did not speak, as if recalibrating, adjusting her approach now that the conversation had not followed the direction she expected. "Misunderstood is a strong word," she said finally, her tone still controlled, but no longer as effortless as before. "I think it is more about making sure expectations are clear moving forward." I nodded once, acknowledging the shift without interrupting it. "Expectations," I repeated quietly, allowing the word to sit between us. "That is an interesting place to begin." Daniel shifted again in his seat, his eyes moving between us now, no longer able to remain entirely removed from the exchange. "Mom, we are not trying to make this complicated," he said, his voice carrying a note of unease, as if he hoped to smooth something that had already begun to unfold beyond his control. I turned my attention to him briefly, offering a small, measured look. I am not the one making it complicated, I replied, not sharply, but with enough clarity that the distinction remained intact. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her posture more engaged now, her expression tightening just enough to reveal that she was no longer entirely comfortable. Then maybe we should just say it directly, she said, her voice gaining a touch of firmness. We feel like there have been times when boundaries were not respected, especially when it comes to decisions about the house and finances. There it was, laid out more clearly now, though still framed in a way that suggested she believed she controlled the narrative. I let a brief silence follow her statement, not as hesitation, but as space that often encourages people to fill it with more than they intend. Which decisions are you referring to? I asked calmly. She glanced at Daniel for a fraction of a second before continuing, a subtle confirmation that this was not entirely her conversation alone, though she was clearly leading it. The help you have given us in the past, she said, choosing her words carefully. It has sometimes felt like it came with expectations attached. Daniel's gaze dropped again at that, and I noticed the way his shoulders lowered slightly, as if the words themselves carried a weight he had not fully examined before. I rested my hands lightly on the table, folding them together in front of me. That is a very specific interpretation, I said, my tone even, not defensive, simply precise. One I do not recall expressing. Ashley's lips pressed together briefly before she responded. You may not have said it directly, but it is there, she insisted. In the way things are brought up, in the way certain topics come back around. I studied her for a moment, not with hostility, but with a kind of quiet attention that often reveals more than confrontation ever could. It is interesting, I said slowly, how something that was given freely can be remembered as something that was taken. The words settled into the room with a noticeable weight, and for the first time that evening, neither of them responded immediately. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around his glass, and Ashley's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that she recognized the direction the conversation was moving. That is not what we are saying, Daniel said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain. I turned to him again, meeting his eyes fully this time. Then perhaps you can explain what you are saying, I replied, offering him the opportunity to define his position rather than allowing it to remain implied. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the truth more clearly than any words could have provided. He did not have a clear explanation, not one that he could articulate without contradiction, because the narrative had not been built by him. It had been accepted by him. Ashley straightened slightly, stepping back into the space he had not filled. We just want things to be balanced, she said, her tone regaining some of its earlier control. We want to feel like we are making our own decisions without outside influence. I nodded slowly, considering her words, not because I needed to agree with them, but because understanding how she framed the situation was far more valuable than challenging it directly. That is reasonable, I said after a moment. Everyone should feel that way in their own home. There was a brief flicker of relief in her expression, as if she believed the conversation had returned to safer ground, but it was short-lived. And clarity helps with that, I added, my voice steady. Clarity about what has been given, what has been received, and what has been assumed. The room grew still again, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence alone, but from recognition, the awareness that something has shifted beyond the surface level of polite conversation. Ashley did not respond immediately this time, and Daniel looked at me with a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something closer to realization, though not fully formed. I did not press further, not because I had nothing more to say, but because I understood that the purpose of this moment was not to conclude the conversation, it was to reposition it, to move it from a place where they believed they held control to a place where that control was no longer certain. I picked up my glass and took a small sip of water, setting it back down with deliberate care. I think we are beginning to understand each other, I said quietly, and this time, the words carried a meaning that extended beyond what was spoken. Ashley nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she was still assessing what that understanding truly meant, and Daniel remained silent, his attention fixed somewhere between the table and the space in front of him, as if he were trying to piece together something that had been presented to him all at once. And as I sat there, watching them both, I realized that the conversation had already done what it needed to do. It had shifted the balance, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more effective, the simple act of seeing clearly and allowing that clarity to be felt without needing to declare it outright. The rest of the evening unfolded with a kind of quiet restraint that felt almost deliberate, as if all three of us understood that something had shifted and none of us were quite ready to push it further just yet. And so we returned to safer topics, small conversations that carried no weight, discussions about work schedules, about the weather changing, about things that could be said without consequence. But the air had changed. That much was undeniable, and beneath every word there was an awareness now that had not been there before. When the plates were cleared and the last of the dishes had been moved to the sink, I rose from my seat with the same calm I had maintained all evening, reaching for my coat without hesitation, without waiting to be asked to stay longer, because I understood that my presence no longer needed to be extended to prove anything. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my tone polite, measured, offering exactly what was appropriate and nothing more. Ashley nodded, her smile returning, though it no longer held the same certainty it once had. "Of course," she replied. "We should do this again sometime." I met her gaze for a brief moment, just long enough to acknowledge the statement without committing to it. "Perhaps," I said simply. Daniel walked me to the door, his movements slower than before, as if he were trying to find something to say, something that might bridge the distance that had become more visible over the course of the evening. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, less rehearsed, and for the first time that day, there was something in his tone that felt closer to sincerity than obligation. I paused at the threshold, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe, and looked at him fully. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," I replied, and there was no hidden meaning in my words, no edge, just a simple statement that carried more weight than either of us chose to unpack in that moment. The drive home was quiet, the streetlights passing one by one in a steady rhythm, and I found myself not replaying the conversation as I might have once done, not searching for things I should have said differently or moments I could have handled better, because there was no need for that anymore. The conversation had unfolded exactly as it needed to, revealing what had been there all along. When I stepped inside my house, the familiar stillness greeted me again, but this time it felt different, not just steady, but resolved, as if something that had been unsettled had finally found its place. I removed my coat and set it aside, moving through the rooms without turning on all the lights, allowing the softer glow of a single lamp to fill the space. In the living room, I paused for a moment, my eyes drifting toward the small table where I had placed the contents of that Easter afternoon days earlier. The folded note was still there, untouched since I had set it down, its presence no longer intrusive, but almost symbolic, a reminder not of what had been said, but of what had been revealed. I walked over and picked it up, unfolding it once more, reading the words again with a clarity that had replaced any initial sting. "For everything you have taken, consider this a sweet return." I held it in my hands for a moment, then folded it carefully along the same crease, placing it back exactly where it had been. It no longer needed to be interpreted. It had already served its purpose. I moved to the desk and opened the drawer, looking at the folders inside, the records, the notes, everything I had gathered over the past few days, and I realized that I did not feel the urgency to act immediately, not because there was nothing to be done, but because I had already taken the most important step. I had seen clearly, without distortion, without denial. There is a certain kind of power in that, a quiet, steady power that does not rely on confrontation or approval, but on understanding and choice. I closed the drawer and turned off the lamp, allowing the room to settle into darkness, and as I made my way upstairs, I felt no need to rush the next move, no pressure to resolve everything at once, because I understood now that not every situation requires a dramatic ending. Sometimes the most meaningful shift happens in silence, in the decision to no longer participate in a version of reality that does not align with the truth you have come to recognize. As I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I thought briefly of Daniel, of the hesitation in his voice, of the uncertainty in his eyes, and I knew that whatever came next for him would be his own to face, just as what came next for me would be mine to choose. I closed my eyes then, not with questions, but with a kind of calm certainty, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer waiting for someone else to define my place. I had already begun to define it for myself, and that, more than anything else, was enough.